couple of data surprises have shocked the markets to the downside, including a very strong jobs report. The last CPI report that came out last week saw headline inflation come down, or go up rather, but core inflation go down. That shows me that the energy prices and food prices of the previous month's reading came down, but overall services are still high for Americans. That presents a challenge for the ordinary person. Is inflation still going to be sticky for 2025, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about the CPI all day long. That's a flawed index. We've talked about this before, you and I on your show. First of all, core inflation doesn't include food or fuel. Your audience should look at me. Any index that doesn't include lunch is of no interest to me, right? I eat, I drive. Let's just use common sense, David. Ask your listeners to think back to the year 2020 and then fast forward to 2025. Think what's happened to the price of their groceries. If they're American, think what's happened to their health insurance or their health care costs. Think what's happened to rent or mortgages or groceries. These are all political issues. The idea that the basket of goods and services that you consume to run the Lin family has only gone up by 2.5 or 2.6% a year compounded in the period 2020 to 2025 is farcical. And yet people look at this index as though it were real. This is just common sense. In the United States, there's a huge incentive to have the CPI understate inflation. That is that all of the entitlements which we can't afford are geared to the CPI. The CPI cost of living increase for Social Security, as an example, is set to the CPI, 2.6%, when in fact, the underlying depreciation of the purchasing power of the US dollar is probably more like 7.5% or 8%. And frankly, it's worse, not better, in Canada.
So what needs to be done to increase or improve the living standard for the average American consumer?
Get out of the way. Just get out of the way. Just deregulate. I mean, listen, I could go on about this forever. Right now, the cost of the federal government, not state and local governments, the cost of the federal government is 36% of GDP. If you reduced tax, you would lower the cost of living of every single working American and Canadian family.
I'd like to get your take on this because incoming and outgoing secretaries of the Treasury have completely different opinions on how the tax structure should be implemented. So Scott Bessent has said recently, last week,
as we begin 2025, Americans are barreling towards an economic crisis at year end. If Congress fails to act, Americans will face the largest tax increase in history.
He testified to Congress that should they not renew the 2017 tax cuts, Americans would face an economic calamity. I believe he said his words were that the middle class would face the largest tax increase in history. Janet Yellen, outgoing Secretary of the Treasury, said the exact opposite. Tax cuts would be, she said, would roil financial markets. So which side of the spectrum are you on?
Neither. We don't have a revenue problem.
Okay.
We have a spending problem.
Okay.
The difficulty, I mean, yes, they charge too much. The reason they charge too much is because they have to, because they spend too much. Right now, government expenditures are 30% higher than government revenues. Government expenditures in the U.S. are 30% higher than government receipts. This is not a tax problem. This is a spending problem. Let's look at the numbers if you want. This could make a very boring show, but it'll be interesting to me. The on-balance sheet liabilities of the U.S. government are $36 trillion. That's what we owe the bondholders.
Right.
Rather than getting smaller, by the way, U.S. GDP is $30 trillion. That number, rather than shrinking, is growing by $2.5 trillion a year. But that isn't the real problem, David. The real problem you can see by looking at me. There is the net present value of off-balance sheet liabilities in the United States, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, federal pensions, military pensions,